Welcome to another episode of The Curtain Call. In today's episode, I'll be talking to you about the 2010 science fiction film, Beyond the Black Rainbow. This is the directorial debut from Italian-Canadian director Panos Cosmatos, who's probably most well known for his cult film Mandy. Beyond the Black Rainbow is certainly a bold feature film debut, with its highly stylized aesthetic, its general lack of plot, and heavy 1980s movie influence. Rainbow certainly confused filmgoers upon its release 12 years ago, but it's only risen in its appreciation and has really developed a cult following of its own. And it's easy to see why. It's the definition of the perfect midnight movie. What do I mean by this term? The midnight movie is a type of cinema that embraces low-budget genre films that are either created for or transform into movies meant for consuming late at night. These films often contain very specific stylistic choices to create either a dreamy storytelling landscape or for comedic effect, really embrace the cheap B-movie quality of the films. Famous midnight movies that come to mind are Eraserhead, The Rocky Horror Picture Show, El Topo, and The Room. All films that I would recommend to check out in a dark theatre late at night. But Beyond the Black Rainbow is quite different. I'd argue that the film requires this type of viewing to fully understand and embrace the film. I mean, I can pop on Rocky Horror Picture Show whenever I want and still enjoy its musical numbers and campiness. I can see myself catching Eraserhead early in the morning after a cup of coffee and still enjoying the crazy imagery, but I can never really see myself catching Beyond the Black Rainbow at any other time except for late at night. Why, you ask? Well, there's something very unique about Rainbow that keeps bringing people back to it, and why many filmgoers regularly bring it up on comment threads about films that you must check out. And personally, I think this has something to do with the way Beyond the Black Rainbow embraces the excesses of the midnight movie. But before I delve into what I mean by this, please leave a like, subscribe if you want to see more Curtain Call content. So many movies to tackle and so many to talk about. Are there any movies you would recommend that a lot of people don't know about or that you think go underappreciated? What movies frustrate the hell out of you and you need to know a little bit more about what the hell that film was about? Don't worry, don't be shy. Let me know. Okay, thanks for joining in and I hope you enjoy the video. So before I get into the analysis, I suppose I should give a quick review of the film. So the general premise is the film takes us to an alternative 1983, where a mysterious institute called Arborea has set out to achieve true human happiness in a world of great terror and war. This sounds a bit like that film Spiderhead that I reviewed the other week. You're not wrong. Let's just say these ideas kind of get thrown around a lot in science fiction. However, this one has a much more cult-like vibe to it, heavily endorsing the use of psychotropic drugs to enable a true stream of human consciousness. But it becomes quite clear after 10 or so years in operation, time has not been kind to this facility, as its great leader has fallen to illness and is now being founded by a slippery psychiatrist played by Michael Rogers, who has imprisoned a young woman with telekinetic powers for his own scientific interests, keeping her under tight surveillance and control by sinister guards, an insecure assistant who doesn't quite question the morality of this operation, and a mysterious glowing pyramid that inhibits the girl's extraordinary abilities. It's quite clear that the psychiatrist has a dangerous obsession, and while with no one looking for you, how can this girl possibly ever hope for escaping her captor? Now it seems more like the setup of the classic escape film, but when I say that this film really stretches the importance of mood and tone over actual narrative development and events, I really mean it. For the majority of its runtime, one can expect a lot of scenes of setting up ideas, the world and the characters, but not too much actually going on, which will prove to be quite frustrating for most. And I have to say, I felt the same. There's no denying that this film has a really awesome style to it, but after looking at the time and realizing you only have 40 minutes left and not much has really happened, it can quickly become quite an impatient movie to deal with. Even when it does reach its denouement, which I will be discussing a little bit later in detail, you start to realize this film was more an exercise in style and tone than telling a story. It's upon this conclusion that I realized as a whole, this is a film that's meant to be a celebration of dreamlike cinema and a tribute to a bygone era of science fiction cinema, the 1980s. And if you look at the film through those lenses, then yeah, Beyond the Black Rainbow is quite the ride. While watching it, I was thinking about a heavy amount of influences Panos Cosmatos must have had when making this movie. And you're meant to feel this way. Rainbow is a tribute to cerebral, dystopic, cynical science fiction. And Panos isn't ashamed to admit it. So a little bit of interesting backstory behind the filmmaker. Panos was born to a Belgian sculptor, his mum, and a cult filmmaker, George P. Cosmatos, his dad, most known for directing schlocky B-movies such as Rambo First Blood Part 2 and Cobra, films that also embrace challenging the senses, just in this case with endless carnage and violence. Oh, and he directed a little-known Western film called Tombstone, which along with Unforgiven, just revitalized the Hollywood interest in the dying art of the Wild West, which then died again after Wild Wild West. Thanks, Will Smith. So you can definitely say that Panos grew up with cinema all around him, and he remembers regularly attending the video stores in the 1980s and obsessing over the art of VHS cassettes and the awesome covers that came with them, often not even getting the chance to watch the film due to his age. This left a huge imprint on Panos, as he made up stories of what these films were all about. He became more obsessed with following up this era of cinema when he had to deal with the passing of both his mother and father. After my father passed away, I got kind of nostalgic for my childhood and my past, so I started watching all the films I was into back then in a much more emotional way. He reckons every shot of Beyond the Black Rainbow is dripping with influence from his parents. And I mean, you can tell the influence of his mother being heavily inspired by her experimental sculpting and how Panos adores surreal imagery. In order to get his vision across to the screen, he self-financed his directorial debut using the DVD residuals from his dad's film Tombstone of $1.1 million US. But you can't fault the end result not being a masterclass in style. The dedication of the 1980s VHS quality to this film is undeniable, from the beautifully 35mm saturated cinematography using an 80s Panavision camera to the pulsing synth score coming from Jeremy Schmidt of Black Mountain fame. This is an 80s science fiction wet dream. What makes this film stand out as more of a midnight movie than, say, Blade Runner or the first Terminator? Well, I think it comes down to its dreamlike tone. And this is where we're about to head into spoilers, so if you do want to go into this film fresh, please check out the film and come back to this analysis. While a flawed film, I do generally think there is something interesting to witness here. Just don't go expecting anything deep or profound. See it as more deeply surreal, psychedelic cinema. Okay, all caught up now? Let's proceed. So the film begins with an interesting piece of exposition with the founder of Arboria, Dr. Mercurio Arboria, bit of a mouthful, presenting through an old advertisement his institute, promising new ways for the human race to live and explore beyond the boundaries that society has trapped them with. It's a fantastic way to start the film, with an old artifact setting up the film's overall embrace of the past. While the Institute has great intentions, we as a modern audience recognise from our appreciation of science fiction that these institutes usually don't pan out so well and get corrupted down the track by human malice, obsession, and psychosis. It intentionally gives the vibe of an old 1960s reel, reflecting the era of the hippie revolution, thinking instead of guns and war, using the influence of LSD and New Age science to solve all the world's problems. And I mean those visuals and the score. It's just meant to be embraced in the dark theatre late at night, with that slight nervousness of watching old footage of something that should have been kept buried. Well, that's where we find ourselves in the year 1983. Coincidence, it's a year before that seminal George Orwell year, I think not, with an institute that's less hippie and free love, and more authoritative, prison-like, and closed off from society. It's quite clear from stepping into this prison where we find the poor girl captive, that this place is a forgotten relic of the past, and it's being held up by a man who Panos described in his script as an aging surfer calcified into a reptilian wax vampire. I mean, perfectly put, I suppose. And he's brought to life incredibly well by actor Michael Rogers, who's become a real favourite of underground horror films. He incorporates a really emotionless, cold voice into his character, and it works brilliantly well. institute. Certainly not the haven it was painted out to be in the introduction. It's very much a prison and becomes worse once we see the psychiatrist comfortably leave and have the freedom to see his wife. There's an interesting dynamic with his home life though, as he seems to act as a prisoner to his own home and has to cope with the mundanity of this domestic life with drugs. Most of these moments are very quiet with very little dialogue and music, heavily playing into the late night atmosphere that the film should be watched in. The old school optical effects of Norm Lee's cinematography really captured that midnight movie tone. It's all very slow paced and the most impatient of audiences may be turned off quite quickly. It did start to dawn on me that as certain moments were building up to something interesting or eventful, it would then go in the opposite direction and just go to the next scene. I mean, we do get little story tidbits here and there, but it's all very slowly revealed and it takes its time. And the only explanation I can take for this incredibly slow pace is Panos' intention to make it dreamlike and ethereal. The way the film transitions from scene to scene is obvious enough of this, never satisfactorily ending a scene, leaving a lot of questions, slowly fading to black or red in some instances, and just moving on to the next moment. It's all done very intentionally to pace it as if it is all in a dreamy or sleepy state. Well, this dreamlike surrealism comes to a head in the flashback sequence, explaining the psychiatrist's motives for his control over the facility and the girl, in a moment that heavily pays tribute to the experimental horror film Begotten, a nasty little art film from the 90s. The flashback is represented in high contrast black and white, with the visuals being particularly arresting to the human eye. Gone is all the beauty of the 1980s pulpy style, and in comes a scene that is quite frankly the stuff of nightmares. It's certainly the centerpiece of the film, and it's quite the wild ride. This is the essence of the midnight movie. It has no dialogue. It's all music and surreal imagery for 10 long minutes. And it wants to shock you. I mean, imagine watching this during the day. This is best achieved when it's late at night and you're thinking of dozing off in a couple hours. This is what keeps people revisiting David Lynch. This is what keeps people admiring the lunacy of Alejandro Jodorowsky. And it's the moment I started to drop my frustrations for the film and go, this is what midnight movies are. Trippy, breaking the rules, and experimental as f***. A real shame then that the remainder of the film is rather boring and tedious in comparison. But this flashback accomplished its purpose in shock value, and yes, contributed to the backstory of our main antagonist. The rest of the film then fully embraces its trashy 80s vibe by being both a science fiction escape film and a slasher film? And it proudly wears it on its sleeves. I mean, the wife is murdered almost exactly to how Roy Batty murders his father Tyrell in Blade Runner. And the film ends with our anti-hero killing two stoners in the woods for no real plot reason except to include some over-the-top, blood-curdling violence. You can just hear the midnight movie audiences just cheering over these moments. The escape scenes, while the most science fiction fantasy moments in the film, are very reminiscent of other midnight movies. Come on, don't tell me this shot doesn't remind you of the opening of Cube. This is from a director who loves paying homage to this genre and is setting out to make the most midnight movie you've ever laid your eyes on. And so I suppose this film did what it set out to do. I'm not going to convince myself I wasn't left narratively disappointed by the film, and I think Panos did improve exponentially with his follow-up film Mandy, a similarly trippy, surreal movie that has also been accumulating a cult following. But I can't deny that Beyond the Black Rainbow is certainly a bold film debut that nurtures Cosmatos' interest with horror, science fiction, and 80s B-movies, encapsulating the wonders of the midnight movie. To watch this film in any other way than in a dark room at night would be a huge disservice. You feeling a bit tired? Don't pop on another episode of Friends. Pop on Beyond the Black Rainbow. You may not warm up to it, you can't deny it's a passion project from the son of two experimental artists and a true adoration for surreal cinema. So yeah, those are my thoughts on Beyond the Black Rainbow. I hope that gives some clarity to a film that I did find to be quite interesting. If you're a huge fan of this film, want to point your attention to two other surreal pieces of cinema. The first is another feature film debut from none other than George Lucas. That is the film THX 1138. The film that got the future billionaire on the map. The heavy Orwellian depiction of a future. Not only is it a hugely influential film, I also feel it goes relatively unnoticed as a classic science fiction film from the 1970s. And the other film I want to recommend is none other than midnight movie science fiction classic Altered States, with a plot that explores man's experimentation on the human consciousness. What happens when you take too much of your own medicine? A seven-eyed goat crucified to the cross is what happens, bro. So yeah, check those out, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to like, subscribe, and tell me if you were satisfied with what was beyond the rainbow. Keep up to date with more Curtain Call as well. More is coming your way shortly. One that I may have to bring my birthday suit for.